Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Maximizing Microsoft 365 Summit. Today's event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, Rubrik, the Zero Trust data management company, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends, and I'll be your moderator for the first of two information-packed sessions. But before we get started, I need to go over a few housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsor, Rubrik, has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. And last but not least, at the end of the second session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a Nintendo Switch. It's a home console, it's a handheld, it's the only game controller you'll ever need, but you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, Top Tips for Managing and Optimizing Microsoft 365. For this session, we've called on Ben Stejink, owner and cloud consultant at Intelligink. Ben is an information technology pro with extensive experience with Microsoft platforms and applications, including Microsoft 365, SharePoint, and Azure. During his busy career, he has consulted with a wide range of organizations, from 5-person shops to global enterprises in fields ranging from government to professional sports. He is also a co-founder of the Jacksonville, Florida Cloud User Group and co-host of the Microsoft Cloud IT podcast. You are in for a great session. Take it away, Ben.
All right. Thanks a lot, John. Glad to be back doing another one of these and talking all about Microsoft 365 and managing it, optimizing it, different things you want to think about. Like you said, thanks for that intro. I don't need to talk any more about myself because you did a great job at it. I did mix up my pictures a little bit if you've been in some of the other ones. I decided it was time to switch up the picture. Get some more of my kids, my family up there. So, diving into the topic today. I am going to kind of narrow it down to 4 different tips as we go through today and different tips that you can take advantage of when it comes to managing Microsoft 365. So we're going to start with understanding Teams architecture. And while we talk about Teams is the entry point a lot of people come into. But really, this could also be kind of understanding how Microsoft 365 is architected as a whole, and even primarily Microsoft 365 groups. There's a lot of things there, and it ties hand in hand with what that Teams architecture looks like. So we're going to start off kind of talking through some different things there, looking at different aspects of that. From there, we're going to move into lifecycle management. There's a lot of different things in Microsoft 365. So what are things you need to think about when it comes to managing different resources within Microsoft 365? Policies are another one. There's lots of different places within Microsoft 365 that you can assign different policies. There's lots of Teams policies. There's Azure Active Directory policies, conditional access policies. So we'll talk a little bit about leveraging policies within your organization and talking through some of that. And then finally, sensitivity labels. Sensitivity labels continue to grow across the entire Microsoft 365 ecosystem. As those grow, I feel like these are one of those that are probably underutilized some, that when you really start looking at sensitivity labels and some of what you can do with them, really help with managing different aspects of Microsoft 365. So let's go ahead and dive into the first one. understanding Teams architecture. And again, think of this as understanding how all the different pieces of Microsoft 365 fit together. Teams kind of being one of those higher levels where a lot of things get, I would say more things get created when you create Teams than when you create some of the other things. But when it comes to Microsoft 365, one of the big things people hear about is Microsoft 365 groups, especially even before Teams, when these were still Office 365 groups. And people would talk about, oh, I created an Office 365 group and I got all this other stuff with it. Yeah, in a way, but really what a Microsoft 365 group is and what those Office 365 groups are is it is purely a membership list. It is a list of owners and it is a list of members. There is nothing more included with a group. There's other things attached to one of those groups. There's other things that are affected by those groups. But at its root, a Microsoft 365 group is just a membership list. However, when you create a Microsoft 365 group, it does also go out and create a SharePoint site. It used to go out and create a planner plan. For a while, it would go out and create a Power BI workspace. It also goes and creates a shared mailbox in Exchange Online. So understanding that, from the same aspect when you create a team, first thing it does when you create a team, you need a list of members in the team. It creates that Microsoft 365 group. Your SharePoint sites are used for your file storage. You have a secondary SharePoint site that is tied to any private channels. Wikis and teams are creating MHT files in a SharePoint library that's Teams wiki data. It's also still creating a shared mailbox. You start getting into all these intricacies of how these things are interconnected. Yammer plays a part in this. Yammer communities now also create Microsoft 365 groups to deal with membership. I believe now it's fully rolled out where Yammer is using SharePoint for files in Yammer. So really taking a step back and making sure that whether you're a Teams admin or a SharePoint admin, an Exchange admin, or just a admin of a global admin, Azure Active Directory admin, making sure that you understand how all these different pieces and all these different components of your Microsoft 365 environment are connected together. Because, and I've seen this, what other admins do can affect Teams. What other admins do in Teams can affect SharePoint. What other admins do in Exchange can affect Teams. So there's all these different interactions between these different services in Microsoft 365 that you really want to be aware of when it comes to managing that environment. And I'm mixing up my slides a little bit here. We're going to jump into a demo before we start talking about policies, just to kind of show you how some of that interaction happens and what you need to be aware of. So I'm going to jump over here and share my screen. And let's jump back up to Teams. So one of those things you have is I have my demo team. So I'm going to go in here, search for a team just to narrow down my list. And if you haven't looked at this before, you'll see I have some of these demo teams. I have demo team 2, demo team, another demo team 2, demo 2 and demo team 2. All of these different teams have certain SharePoint sites assigned to them. You can also see private channels are associated over here. Things that you need to be aware of when all these are connected is now if I'm my SharePoint admin, I'm going over here, all of a sudden, here's those same 3 teams. These are those active SharePoint sites that are associated with those Microsoft Teams. You can see channel sites. This is a new feature that just came out at Ignite of being able to see these channel sites, which are those private sites created in SharePoint. So over here, you'll see again, I have one private channel, two private channels with demo team, demo 2. Over here, I have that one channel site, those two channel sites, and then going into the Exchange Admin Center, same type of thing. I have that demo 2, that demo team 2, my demo 2. If I was over here in Azure Active Directory, and I'm going to go back here, go to my groups in Azure Active Directory, and go look for demo here. You'll see, once again, demo 2, demo team 2. You will also notice that at each one of these, if I'm an Azure Active Directory admin, I can go in and I could delete demo team 2. If I'm an Exchange admin, I could go in here, I could select demo team 2, I could delete my demo team 2 group from the Exchange Admin Center. I can go into SharePoint, I can select demo team 2, I can delete it from SharePoint. And just like you may have guessed, I can go into Teams. I can select demo team 2 and I can delete it. Guess what happens when I delete that in any one of those admin centers? It disappears from all of the other admin centers. So, well, I may be a Teams admin and I don't see active chats. It doesn't mean someone's not storing files in the SharePoint site. Or conversely, the SharePoint site may appear empty. I may be over here, I look at the SharePoint site. Yeah, it's not using any storage. It hasn't been updated in a while. But guess what? People may still be having conversations within that team. It's not showing in your SharePoint Admin Center. Your SharePoint admin gets overambitious, deletes that site, and all of a sudden all the conversations are gone within the team. Or that shared mailbox in the Exchange Admin Center is gone. Or they're using the Microsoft 365 group for something else, whether it's Flow or Power Automate. And all of a sudden that SharePoint site, it trickles down and it deletes everything. So really understanding how all of these different services and all of these different, all this different functionality is tied together across these different environments, these different services in Office 365. And that's just kind of the big three: Active Directory, Teams, SharePoint, and Exchange. Power BI, they've tried to separate out a little bit now. Planner, there is still some connections there between Planner and possibly deleting a team and deleting the Planner plan that people might be using to track tasks that's associated with it. So really diving in and understanding all of that, making sure all of your different admins understand that relationship between them. One of the things that I've seen when it comes to moving from on-premises to an Office 365 or Microsoft 365 environment is that on-premises, it tended to be a lot easier to work in silos. Your Exchange admin team just managed Exchange. Your Active Directory team just managed Active Directory. They needed to talk. There's permissions. There's still some interactions there, but it wasn't tied together as closely as what you are seeing in Microsoft 365 and in the cloud. So there's a lot of companies that go from that on-premises, they go to Microsoft 365, and they try to keep that same model. And those teams, in my opinion, don't often talk to each other and work together as much as they should when they move to the cloud, primarily due to all these interactions and how everything affects everything else. So I would really encourage any organization that maybe you're the SharePoint admin or you're the Exchange admin and you're not talking as much to these other Teams admins, SharePoint admin, your Active Directory team. Work together. Make sure you're not stepping on each other's toes inadvertently, and you have good communication between all of you when it comes to working with these services. So next, diving into policies, what can users do? What are groups allowed to do? What are users allowed to do? Taking advantage of the groups you've created, the users that you've created, to assign different policies, making your job easier when it comes to configuring Microsoft 365. One of the examples I have here is the implementation type of Teams policies, particularly when it comes to meetings. This is one of those, it's a little bit confusing sometimes. Different policies in Teams have per organizer policies. An example is automatically admitting people. This is a meeting policy that is only going to apply to whoever organizes the meeting. It doesn't matter what the user's policy is set to. You also have per user policies when it comes to Teams meetings. And one of these is allow meet now channels. This isn't one of those that is tied specifically to a meeting. It's one-on-one meetings. So it's whether or not you're going to allow users to have one-on-one meetings with other people. And then you do get some of these policies too that are per organizer and per user. This is when both policies have to align. If an organizer does not allow cloud recording, none of the users can start recording a meeting. However, if the organizer does allow cloud recording, but a user has it blocked, you're not going to be able to start that cloud recording. So understanding policies, particularly in Teams. Teams is where you see the most amount of policies that you can take advantage of, and then policy packages in Teams as well. So now you're not having to go in and assign, I want to say there's maybe 6 or 8 different places you can assign policies in Teams. Rather than having to go into all 8 of those places to assign policies in Teams, go in, assign them a policy package so they automatically get all of those policies rolled up into one nice package. So taking a look at policies in Teams and policies in Active Directory, let's dive in and take a look at some of the policies that you can assign in Microsoft 365 as well to help you manage it. So one of those, we just talked about Teams. We'll start in Teams. We'll move down to some of the other places you can assign policies as well. This is where you'll see you have team policies, you have template policies, you have Teams update policies. So we're up to 3 there. You can go down and you have meeting policies, live event policies, messaging policies, all of these different policies that you can go in and assign. And going back to what we talked about with the Microsoft 365 groups, this is another place you could be using some of those groups, is for a lot of these different policies, meeting policies in particular, you can also have group policy assignments where I can go in, I can pick a certain group. So we could go look for those same ones. We've been working with Demo Team 2. So I want to assign Demo Team 2 to a certain policy in Microsoft Teams. Maybe Demo Team 2 is allowed to do everything. So I can go ahead and assign Demo Team 2 that individual meeting policy. I could do the same for all of these other, most of these other policies. Not all policies you can do group assignments to. I can't remember which one it was. Teams policies has group assignments. One of these, I know there was not group assignments on it. But like I just showed you, you have all of these different policies that you can apply, but down here you have policy packages. Microsoft was nice. They created a bunch of them for you. So if you're in one of these segments, education, frontline workers, healthcare, some small and medium-sized business, some of these policy packages are already created for you. And if you go in and look at one of these, you'll see there's going to be certain policies assigned, certain messaging policies, meeting policies, app policies, tolling policies. So you can just assign, instead of going in and assigning a group all 4 of these policies, you just go in and assign this policy package to the group. If you want to create your own, maybe you want to take some of your own custom policies, you can go in, set up a policy package. So this is maybe our Demo Team 2 policy package. And we need to assign them a certain messaging policies. We'll go with our default. We also want to assign a certain meeting policy. Same type of thing. We can do everything. Go in and save that policy package, and now you have your own custom policy packages that you can assign to really make sure you hone your team's environment to what you want. Another one of those places you can assign policies is jumping down to Azure Active Directory. These are some of my favorite policies. This is one of those policy types that does require you to have an Azure Active Directory premium license. But this is one, more and more, I start saying, if you're going to do Microsoft 365, you might as well get an Azure Active Directory premium. You get a lot of security benefits, particularly from these conditional access policies in general. In here, this is where you can really start refining what services people are allowed to access, what apps people are allowed to access, where they can access them from. More and more, almost most of the clients I talk to end up wanting some form of this or some version of this. Whether or not Microsoft should charge you extra to get this feature or not, we're not going to get into that today, but this is one of my all-time favorite policies that you can use in Microsoft 365. So just to create a new demo one here, we're going to go in here and do a new demo conditional access policy. And one thing to be aware of, it is possible to lock yourself out of Microsoft 365 when it comes to creating these policies. So depending on what you have set up, be careful. You'll even see Microsoft puts a warning down here. Don't lock yourself out. This policy affects the Azure portal as well as Microsoft 365. So be aware of that. But this is one, you can go in, you can assign it to all your users. Again, Microsoft makes sure, don't lock yourself out. You can assign it to certain groups. So we've been working with our demo team too a lot. So we could go in and assign this policy to demo team 2. Maybe we want to limit demo teams 2's access to certain cloud apps. We can limit their access to all the cloud apps, or you can go in and start selecting applications. And you'll see this isn't limited to just Office 365 applications. This includes any application that is tied into your Azure Active Directory tenant. So if you're using your Azure Active Directory credentials to log into any application, it's going to be listed here, and you can put a conditional access policy in place. For now, we're just going to stick with Office 365. We can narrow it down further. I can go down and look for just Teams. I can look for just SharePoint in here, Exchange. There was Office 365, SharePoint Online. You have Exchange in here. Any one of those services that you may want to limit access to or set certain conditions around. Then some of those conditions. What's my user sign-in risk? Do I have some users that are deemed risky? Are they signing in from a particular platform, from Windows, from Android, from iOS? What location are they signed in for? Are they signing in from a location where I know none of my employees are? Maybe I want to block any country that isn't the country I reside in because none of my employees, none of my users should be logging in from another country other than my own. Or even based on IP address. You only want users to access your cloud apps from your local office or when they're on a VPN connection. You can actually limit that location down to a single IP address or a block of IP addresses that you know they have to be somehow connected to your corporate network in order to be coming from that IP address, and only then can they even access your Office 365 environment. You can do locations. You can limit which apps they're allowed to use. Are they only allowed to use the browser? Can they use different mobile applications or desktop apps? Do you want to configure that? And device state. This is interesting. This is preview. It's being depreciated. Don't worry about it. Filter for devices. This is a new feature that's super powerful. Which devices should be able to access it based on computer name, based on manufacturer? You know you don't buy any HP computers. An HP computer should never be accessing your environment. So let's just go in and say if the manufacturer is HP, we're going to actually go ahead and block access to Office 365 from any HP device. Maybe it's an Apple device, Android device, whatever it is. You also have trust type. So are they joined to your Active Directory environment or not? Are these corporate-owned devices that are joined to Active Directory, either hybrid or Azure AD joined? Let's go ahead and apply a certain policy there. And then going down to those access controls, what are you actually going to do? Are you going to grant access but require compliant devices, require multi-factor authentication? Are you going to require that they use one of your approved client apps? Lots of different options there for those access controls. Session controls, you can do a lot of different things here as well around, do you want to keep persistent browser sessions? Do you want to require a certain sign-in frequency? Some of these newer ones, these preview ones, conditional access app control, me and another friend talked for like an hour just on trying to figure out how this works the other day, way more than we have time to go into today. But take a look at these policies within your conditional access. One of the other interesting things with conditional access policies as well, I'm going to make sure I cancel this so I don't lock myself out. You'll notice I have a couple in here. SharePoint Admin Center, block access on unmanaged apps, use app-enforced restrictions for browser access. These are off right now, but some applications, based on the policy you set, are actually automatically created here by the application. So jumping back to our SharePoint Admin Center and looking at policies here, and access control, unmanaged devices, this right here, allow full access from desktops, allow limited web-based access, block access. This unmanaged device policy is actually what created this policy right here in conditional access. So if you've ever gone into SharePoint, you've managed SharePoint, and you've seen that this is disabled, or it's telling you you need to enable your Azure Active Directory Premium license to set up some of these policies in SharePoint, that's why. It's actually using that Azure Active Directory Premium license on the back end and going in and creating a conditional access policy for you automatically within Azure Active Directory. So that is, keeping an eye on time here, policies. I do see, I'm going to go take a look at this. Conditional access policies, license requirements. Azure Active Directory Premium. P1 is the base level license for using conditional access policies. Anything that includes that will work. So Azure Active Directory P1, P2, any of your EMS licenses are going to include it. So EMS E3 and E5 contain Azure Active Directory Premium P1 and P2 respectively. Same type of thing with Microsoft 365 E3 and Microsoft 365 E5 contain EMS E3 and E5 respectively, Azure Active Directory Premium P1 and P2 respectively. So that is any plan that includes Azure Active Directory Premium P1 or above, which is just P2, is how you can get conditional access. Or again, any plan that it includes. And I think the MSRP on that is like $6 a user a month. I've seen mixed reactions to people or mixed answers on how this has to be licensed. Is, do you have to license every user in your organization to use conditional access? Or do you only have to license users that conditional access applies to? I am not a licensing expert. I am not going to provide any legal advice on how many licenses you need to get of Azure Active Directory Premium to leverage conditional access. Talk to whoever you purchase your licenses from about how many of these you need in order to take advantage of it. Again, just because I've seen mixed things, I haven't always gotten a straight answer. So talk to whoever licenses it, but that's going to be that license level you need. So diving into our next topic, and sensitivity labels. I don't even have slides for this because I started coming up with sensitivity labels in Microsoft 365, and I'm like, this one isn't even a good one for slides. So we're just going to keep going with demos. But this is number 3, sensitivity labels. I'm going to get rid of some of these. This is going to be in your compliance center in Microsoft 365. So compliance.microsoft.com. And then you go look for information protection. If you don't have information protection in your navigation on the left, click on Catalog under Solutions. Go find information protection. You can view it. Once you view it, you can actually pin it to your navigation, move it from your navigation, open the solution. Sensitivity labels. I love sensitivity labels. Sensitivity labels, I believe the base sensitivity labels start with an Office 365 E3 license and above. So not the Microsoft 365, but Office 365 E3 and above. Certain features of it require more. Auto labeling is an E5 feature. But we're just going to focus on what you can actually do with labels in Microsoft 365. So you can see I have a bunch of these already. And you'll even see I have different scopes here. A bunch of these are just files and emails. You'll notice some of these I have down here are sites and unified groups. Whenever you see unified group, think Microsoft 365 group. Whenever you hear Microsoft 365 group, think it also applies to Teams. Super helpful. When it comes to some of that naming, it always seems to be different places. Sensitivity labels can help protect your content. It can help even guide and direct users in terms of what they're allowed to do in Microsoft 365. So just like before, we're going to go in and create a label from scratch. We'll call this up with something different. This is the demo. I'm very uncreative. Demo sensitivity. I can't spell either. Label. Right click or left click for it. You would think I would have this. It's right up above. Sensitivity. There we go. The red line was bugging me. OCD too. Display name. What do they want to see when it's published? We're just going to choose the same name for this one. So we'll do a demo sensitivity label, description for users, some description for this label about when to use the demo sensitivity label. Description for admins, they want to use it. So we can go next. Now we come up with the scope. So off the bat, you get 3 options, files and emails. This is going to be Word documents, Excel documents, different files that are stored in that location, emails within Outlook. You can also see you can use this in Azure, Office. You can do some auto labeling with these. Groups and sites. This is going to be protecting Teams, protecting Microsoft 365 groups, protecting SharePoint sites. Azure Purview. I have not used Azure Purview, but this even goes down into including Azure Blob Storage and SQL storage. I'm going to uncheck that one just for the sake of this demo, and then go next. Files and emails. I'm just going to select everything so you can see all the options. Based on this, label, you can now automatically encrypt files and emails to control who can access them. You can mark these files, headers, footers, whatever you want to do. So those are going to be our file and email settings. Groups and sites we'll get to in a minute. This is one of those weird navigations where based on what you selected here, you will get different options next. So now we're just encryption, auto labeling. Let's go mark content of files. Now you can go start configuring what is the sensitivity label going to do? What are those encryption settings? So are you going to assign permissions automatically when that sensitivity label is applied? So user access to this content applies so many days after a label is applied. It applies on a specific date. Some of these are actually new. I haven't seen some of these before. They're always throwing new stuff in here. So what are you going to do from an encryption perspective? Or do you actually want to remove encryption if it's labeled? Do you encrypt automatically? And if a sensitivity label is applied, you're going to go in and remove that encryption. If you're going to allow offline access to it or not. This is sensitive information. This is confidential information. We are actually going to go in now and completely block offline access to this file. So it has to validate who you are, validate your user. There's no taking an offline file and caching it. And then going in and assign those permissions. Who do these encryption permissions actually apply to? This is going to be another one of those. You can do certain users, you can do groups, specific email addresses or domains. If you're sharing this with external people and you only want to block offline access to a certain organization that you share content with, you're just going to apply it to all the users. So lots of different options here in terms of what those permissions are you want to assign. Going down to, I need to assign permissions to someone. Let's do user groups. We're going to keep going with our demo team 2. Add that one in. We'll go ahead and save that sensitivity label. There we go. Content marking. Do you want to automatically add watermarks, headers, footers? Pretty basic here when it comes to how you want to add those or mark certain documents. Auto labeling, I actually see that was perfect timing. I see a question out there of can you use keywords to add labels? Yes, with the auto labeling. So just, it's going to add up. It's an E5 license to do the auto labeling because of the compute it requires. But this is where you can start doing content contains, sensitive info types, or trainable classifiers. You can go in and do trainable classifiers. You can also do sensitive info types and define your own sensitive info types based on keywords, based on regular expressions. So you can do auto discovery, auto labeling based on sensitive info types based on the contents of a file. I worked with one particular client who actually wanted to do the reverse of, instead of actually marking and labeling sensitive information, they still labeled it, but they wanted to keep certain information out of their SharePoint environment. So whenever a certain keyword was detected or a certain pattern of text was detected in a file, because these files, due to certain regulations, had to have certain text in them, they would label it and then alert whenever that file was labeled so they could actually go in and pull it out of their SharePoint environment. But you can also do the reverse. If a file is saved with sensitive, if there's something in the header of it, there's certain regular expressions like, and we can use one of these sensitive info types that are already there. We could go in and say if this contains, I can spell, ABA routing number. It's easy. ABA routing number. So if the content contains ABA routing number, go ahead and auto label this. Anything that has an ABA routing number in it as this demo label that we're creating. So there is auto labeling. It is an additional license on top of the normal just create a sensitivity label. And then we get into the groups and sites. So groups and sites, again, are also going to apply to teams. Privacy and external access settings, external sharing, and conditional access. So conditional access, again, goes back to those conditional access policies we looked at before. If we go next, let's say you label a particular team or a particular site as confidential. You want to force that to be a private team or a private Microsoft 365 group, a private SharePoint site. That should not be visible to anybody. You can go in now. So instead of when users create teams, they have to sit there and think, well, what does public mean? What does private mean? Is it supposed to be private? Is it supposed to be public? Users don't always know that. Users know classified, non-classified, client site, internal site. Those types of things users know. So why not go in and when they create teams, not make them choose public or private, but let them choose what type of team am I creating or what type of site am I creating, and automatically set the privacy accordingly. Choose whether or not you're going to allow those external guests. Or if it doesn't matter, if you do want to leave it up to them, you set it to none, and a user can actually pick and choose whether they want private or public. Conditional access, same type of thing. What types of content can this be shared with? So maybe you're going to allow guests, but only existing guests. Or maybe you're going to share it with external users, but you don't want people to create anonymous links. It has to be a user that's invited as a guest user. Sensitivity labels will go in and lock down those SharePoint sites and set these settings on your SharePoint site, on your Teams, which is still a SharePoint site, going back to all of these things that are interconnected, so that content can only be shared in a certain way. Conditional access policies, you'll recognize this. This is that those same SharePoint settings. If you want to allow full access from desktop apps, or if you only want users of this site to be limited to web-based access only. So it really, again, helps you just narrow down, helps you guide users into selecting the right, setting up your environment in a way that it's supposed to be, and making that selection for users easier. So once you go there, it's just next. We weren't going to worry about purview. We can go in here, go create the label, and it will go create the sensitivity label for you so that you can go use it. So now if I would go into Teams, and I'm just going to show you this in Teams. If I can sign in here quickly. I'm running out of time. If I would go into Teams and create a new Teams tenant now, what it would actually show me is force me to choose one of those sensitivity labels when I'm creating a team. Or while that loads, let's go back into my SharePoint environment. And you can actually see in my active sites now, I will expand out my active sites. One of my columns in here is those sensitivity labels. So I can go look at all of those different sites that, maybe these are all internal sites. Apparently I don't have any internal sites that I've created yet with that sensitivity label on it. Demo failure. Filter by client. I know I should have some there. Or it's just going to completely fail on me today. In theory, that should work, to go in and look at my SharePoint sites. I don't know why that filter. Oh, it was the hub. See, I had an extra filter running on there. There you go. There's some client sites that now have that particular sensitivity label on that. Or now I should be able to go in, have some internal sites in there as well. So I can identify those sites that have certain sensitivity label settings. Teams did not let me sign in. So Teams would also give me that option. I go create a new team, and now instead of choosing private or public, I have to choose one of those sensitivity labels, and it directs me accordingly. I see another question. Could be used for payroll deposit to send email securely to an outside payroll company. Yes, that can absolutely be done. If it detects certain information, I've had this before. I forget sometimes I have some of these on. I send a W-9 or tax forms via email that happen to have like a routing number in there or happen to have like EIN in there. And I have one set that automatically encrypts those emails. So it automatically sends an end-to-end encrypted email to that recipient based on the contents of that email as well as the contents of any file attachments on that email. So sensitivity labels can absolutely automatically be used to securely email content to various people. So really quick, the last one here is just lifecycle management. There's a lot to lifecycle management when it comes to Microsoft 365. Creation of different resources. We talked about Teams creation. Going in and limiting Teams creation so that users have to go through a certain approval process or a certain series of steps to get new teams. Do the exact same thing for SharePoint sites. SharePoint sites are easier to limit as long as you limited teams, going back to all that interconnectedness. But limiting Teams creation is another one of those. This is another reason that I said just go get Azure AD P1. It helps with limiting that Teams creation so you don't end up with like 20 teams in your environment for every single holiday party that you schedule. Let's think through how teams get created. Leveraging naming policies. This is another one of those that if you want to enforce certain naming policies on your Microsoft 365 groups, you can actually set up naming policies so that you can block certain words. People aren't putting inappropriate words or words that, for whatever reason, you don't allow in your Microsoft 365 groups. Again, it's going to then apply to Teams. It's going to help with your SharePoint naming conventions. You can set up naming policies in Azure Active Directory. Setting up templates. There was some announcements around Ignite around some new SharePoint provisioning templates. You can set up templates in Teams. You can even do like PowerShell scripts, going back to different ways to do custom. There's a few of those built-in ways for Teams and SharePoint. But there's custom options too, third-party options to make sure that when somebody goes and creates a new project site within your environment, that project site in SharePoint has certain document libraries created, has certain content types on it, if you've ever worked with content types in SharePoint. Give all of those SharePoint sites uniformity so that as you're supporting those, as you're helping your end users with SharePoint, they're all familiar. As users use different sites, they have a common layout to them, so users can use them effectively. Templates are a big one. Another one, again, I don't think enough people, in my opinion, take advantage of templates. They just kind of let people go wild. Teams templates is relatively new. You can automatically now set certain apps to be included in Teams. You can have certain channels automatically created whenever you create a team. So maybe project sites have 2 or 3 different channels or teams that you use for a project. So look at how is stuff getting created in your environment and what processes do you have in place. One, to make sure people aren't just creating stuff they're never going to use, but 2, so you do have certain naming conventions and naming policies that you may want to follow. And then going a step further is not only do you often want to work with the creation of content, but what are you doing to review what's currently out there. What are you doing to maybe archive certain information or to expire it and auto-delete it? Access reviews are, sorry, I pulled my headset out of my phone. Access reviews are another one of those. A lot of people will assign guests or invite guests to a SharePoint site, and then they never go back and say, does this user still need to be allowed to access this content? A lot of these do require those additional licenses. I tried to call out all of those where you do need those Azure Active Directory Premium P1 licenses, or you need those a P2 license in the case of access reviews. But really think through, how is content getting created and what am I doing to get rid of content in your environment? Archiving it, Teams specifically, you can go to and archive a team. It actually places everything in the read-only state. The Teams team, it places your SharePoint site in a read-only state. So you can kind of freeze that content at a certain point in time, later get rid of it if nobody needs to update it anymore. So a lot of benefits there of going in and archiving some of the stuff and deleting it once you don't need it any longer. So some of these features we talked about. We're going to go share the screen once more and go find my Azure Active Directory environment. This is that access reviews I just talked about. So Azure Active Directory, if you're in your Azure Active Directory environment, you go under your identity governance. And within identity governance, you can go set up these access reviews. So I have in mind access reviews that have already taken place. I should have one of them at least in here. I have a review guest access across all my Microsoft 365 groups. So I can go in and look at this policy, look at these different groups that are in my environment that had reviews, who the reviewers are, who gets an email when one of these groups is up for review. I actually just got one the other day that said, these two users still have access to this group. They haven't accessed it in like 6 months or 9 months. Do you still want them in here? So these are those settings, general settings, review guests across my environment, send email notifications, send reminders. I have my reviewers. This runs semi-annually, every 90 days. I don't have an end date on it. It goes in and sends that review, and then it auto-applies the results to resources. So when I get this review, I go in, I can look at what happened or which those users are. If I go in and deny that review, it's going to automatically go in and remove those users for me. So this takes away from that need to keep track of which users got invited to which groups, where do they need to be reviewed. One of those security vulnerabilities is a user that you gave access to 2 years ago, and for whatever reason still has access to it. Maybe it was a short-term project that you did with them, but they don't need to keep access for it for 2 years. They could still go in and log in anytime and see what's been updated or what's added and grab content out of there. So proactively set up these access reviews to go in, look through your groups, look for, in this case, external access, and then remove those external users from those groups. Another one that we talked about was those naming conventions. This is one of those that's in your Azure Active Directory under your groups, and you have that group expiration in that naming policy. I'll start with naming policy, since I mentioned that one. Go and update a CSV file. So this is going to be blocked words. These are words that I don't want my users to use when they name a team. Maybe it could be inappropriate words, or maybe this could simply be you don't want somebody to use something like HR or human resources. You want them to be more specific with their team. So you block some of those generic words that you don't want included, or certain naming policies. So this would be every group that gets created, we're going to add a certain prefix or a certain attribute, or use a certain attribute to prefix that group name. So this is going to go take the department of the person who created the group, add a prefix on there of the department of the user creating the group. So now you start being able to identify different groups or different teams that are created based on the prefix that's applied to them. Conversely, you could do a suffix. You could do a prefix and a suffix. So going in and really being able to not just have generic names in there, but put some meaning behind your Microsoft 365 groups or your teams. And then expiration is another one of those. What are these group lifetimes? After 180 days, we're going to go contact someone. So I'm going to go, this is going to be if there's not an owner. If there's not an owner on that group, they can't email the owner. I want them to alert me. Otherwise, this is going to automatically alert the owner of the Microsoft 365 group or the Microsoft 365 team, SharePoint site, all those, again, interconnected services. And I want to go set this up for all groups. They will get a notification. Your group is going to expire. It's been 180 days. Do you still need this? Once they get that email notification, they can choose to go out and extend it. And it's going to extend all of that content too, the SharePoint, Teams, Power BI, anything associated with that group. If they don't respond or if they confirm that they no longer need this particular group, you can go in and it'll automatically delete that group once that expiration notification either expires or users choose that, hey, we no longer care about this group. It's okay to go ahead and delete it. So that is, time got away from me a little bit more on that demo. That is all I have. I don't know. I didn't see any other questions. So any other quick questions?
We had, hey, Ben, John Waters here. So it looks like we've got time for just one quick question. Shelley is asking, can you create custom attributes?
Can you give me some more context there, Shelley? Is that custom attributes on the naming policies, maybe, based on that question? Custom attributes, when it comes to naming policies, are just going to be the attributes that you can select. So right now, they don't have custom. Mm-hmm. Maybe they'll come, maybe they won't. But I'm assuming that's what you're asking about, and short answer is no, not right now.
Okay. All right. Well, okay, she wrote back in. She said, yes, naming policy. Okay.
All right.
All right. Hey, Ben, thank you for a great session. That's all the time we have right now. Many thanks to Ben Stejink for a great session and to our sponsor, Rubrik, the Zero Trust Data Management Company, for making it possible. We're going to take a short break, very short, but we'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session, Best Practices for Microsoft 365 Security, Backup, and Recovery, led by scientist, author, and 20-time Microsoft MVP, Brian Posey, and moderated by my colleague, David Rammel, who leads the editorial team at Virtualization and Cloud Review. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsor. And remember, during today's second session, we'll be giving away a Nintendo Switch, but you must be present to win, so stay tuned. Back in a few.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and, of course, Rubrik for underwriting the summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit called Best Practices for Microsoft 365 Security, Backup, and Recovery. I'd like to introduce our speaker for this session, Brian Posey, freelance technology author and 20-time Microsoft MVP. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and created numerous full-length video training courses and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column. Yes, he's in astronaut training at redmondmag.com. Brian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, David. Yeah, and that picture on the slide that was taken just very, very recently. Thanks to COVID, that was the very first time I'd been in a spacesuit in 2 years, so I cannot even begin to tell you how great it felt to be back. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, before I jump in, there's one thing that I need to address. As some of you all might remember, I was asked to speak on exactly the same topic roughly about a month ago. And I want to let you know up front that this presentation is not just going to be a rehash of what I just did recently. I would say roughly about 90% of the material in this presentation is new. Now, that's not to in any way undermine the importance of that previous presentation. If anything, I would consider that one to be a part one and this to be a part two. Now, if you didn't see that previous presentation, you don't need that as a prerequisite for this one. There's nothing that I'm going to be covering in this one that needs information that was presented previously in order for you to understand it. The two function standalone, no problem. But if you didn't catch that previous presentation, I would encourage you to go back and check it out. That presentation was a bit more hands-on, whereas this one is going to be more conceptual. So why fill two presentations with information on the same topic? Well, sure, part of the reason is because that's what I was asked to speak on, but the bigger reason is that security and backup and recovery are hugely important topics that there's a ton of information on, and it would be impossible to cover it all in a single presentation or even in two presentations. I could probably fill 10 presentations with material on that topic. So another question is, why talk about security and backups together within the same presentation? Well, if you really think about it, both security and backup and recovery fall under the umbrella of data protection. Now, what do I mean by data protection? If you were to go out on the web and Google data protection, you're probably going to see a million different definitions. Everybody seems to have their own idea about what data protection is. In reality, it's probably more like 6 or 8 definitions, but the point being that everybody has their own idea of what encompasses data protection. Well, if you know me or you know my work, you know I like to keep things simple. So I tend to think of data protection as taking steps to keep anything bad from happening to your data. That's my definition of data protection. And that's the definition that I'm going to be using as I go throughout this presentation. So if you really stop and think about it, backups fit very well into this definition of data protection, because when you back up your data, you're making sure that you have a way of getting that data back in the event that something bad happens. The same thing can be said about security. When you implement various security mechanisms, what you're doing is you're taking steps to keep anything bad from happening to your data. So throughout this discussion, I'm going to be intertwining the topics of backup, recovery, and security. I'm going to try to maintain a fairly even balance between backups and security, but there may be just a little bit more of one than the other. We'll see how it goes as we go along. Another thing that I want to point out before I really get into the meat of the presentation is that, especially throughout the first half of the presentation, I'm going to be giving a lot of statistics. Now, as I was researching this presentation last week, I started thinking about something that one of my college professors said way back when. I did take statistics in college, and on the very first day of class, one of the first things that that professor said was that in this world, there are liars and there are statisticians, and of the two, statisticians are far worse. And he followed up by saying that the reason for that is that statisticians can make numbers say absolutely anything that they want. So I'm sure we've all seen dubious statistics that are used to further some sort of agenda. That seems to be the norm in this world. I've tried to stay away from anything overly questionable as I was assembling this presentation. But what I want you to know is that the statistics that I'm giving you, although I do not question their validity in the particular context that they were presented, you should think of them more as ballpark estimates rather than absolute truths, because there are so many different things that can impact the accuracy of those statistics within the confines of a particular environment. So let me give you some examples. There are all kinds of things that can influence statistics. For example, the size of the company. There are estimates out there, and I'm going to be talking about these a little bit later on, as to how much an hour of downtime costs. And some of these estimates are absolutely outrageous. If you're working in a tiny business, then some of those estimates of what an hour of downtime costs might even exceed the amount of money that your company generates in an entire week. If, on the other hand, you're working in one of the largest enterprises in the world, then that number might be ridiculously small. So you have to look at the size of the company as you're considering the various statistics that I'm going to be presenting. Also, you have to think about the type and the value of the data that's lost when you're considering the financial impact of that data loss event. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose for a moment that your organization has some really important business critical data, but you've also got some data that you don't really care anything about. It's just taking up space on a server and it doesn't really add any value to the company. If you lost that data, you're probably not going to care so much, and it may not even have any kind of noticeable impact on the organization's revenue. If, on the other hand, you lost that super important data, well, then you've got a big problem, and there are probably going to be drastic financial consequences to that data loss event. Also, the volume of data that you lose. If you lose one file, even if that file is something important, it's probably not going to be catastrophic for the organization. Certainly it's not going to be a good thing, and there are going to be consequences to it, but losing one file probably isn't going to cause your entire organization to crash and burn. On the other hand, if you lose a massive amount of data, it's a different story. The amount of time required to recover is also something that comes into play with all of these statistics. So if, for example, you suffer a major data loss event, but you manage to recover in a matter of seconds, well, then it's probably not going to affect things all that much. Whereas if you're down for weeks and weeks, then you're probably going to end up going out of business. And then you also have to consider other damage that's done after the data loss event and after the recovery operation. I'm talking about things like regulatory penalties, bad press, and things that are connected to the data loss event, but not directly. So let's move on. One of the big things that I want to talk about in this presentation is why it's so important to protect your Microsoft 365 environment, both from a security standpoint and from a backup and recovery standpoint. And the number one reason is because in this world, bad things do happen. Data loss happens. So I found some really interesting statistics as I was researching this presentation. The first one, every week, 140,000 hard drives crash in the United States. So think about that for a moment. That's just the United States, not the entire world, just the U.S., and that's every single week. Now, admittedly, we're talking about Microsoft 365. That's a SaaS application up in the cloud, so hard drive failures don't really play into that. But I still chose to include this particular statistic because, one, I found it astounding. Two, it underscores the fact that data loss can and does happen. Let's move on. 31% of PC users have lost all of their files due to events beyond their control. 31%, that's a third of everybody out there, has lost absolutely everything on their PC because of some sort of event. So presumably that's data that's residing locally on the PC, but you have to remember that these same people are generally connected to the cloud and accessing data up in the cloud. So if that data loss event on their PC stems from a security incident, such as a ransomware attack, well, you have to at least question what that's going to do to Microsoft 365 data that the user has access to or to other cloud data. Let's move on. 34% of companies fail to test their backups, and of those that do, 77% have found tape backup failures. This is something I'm going to be talking about a little bit later on, but I want you to remember the statistic. About 77% have found tape backup failures. From there, 40% of businesses that experience a critical IT failure go out of business within a year. So moving right along, there's a few more that I want to give you before we really get into the Microsoft 365 stuff. 94% of companies suffering from a catastrophic data loss do not survive. 43% never reopen, 51% close within 2 years. Again, I'm not saying that these statistics hold true in every single situation, but the thing that I found interesting about that particular point was that it points to the idea that there can be long-term consequences to data loss. Because according to the statistic, not every company that suffered catastrophic data loss went out of business right away. For some, it was a slow death taking up to 2 years, but it did eventually happen. And then just beneath that, we have 7 out of 10 small firms that experience a major data loss go out of business within a year. So apparently, the consequences to having a catastrophic data loss event are a lot more dire for smaller organizations than larger organizations. Larger organizations presumably have greater financial resources and can hang on a little bit longer, whereas a smaller organization that experiences of an event of roughly the same magnitude may not have quite the resources that a large organization would have and would probably go out of business much more quickly. And then there are potential costs of data loss. Now, again, as I said earlier, you have to consider the organization size, but according to one estimate, downtime results in a cost of roughly $8,500 plus per hour, depending on the company size. Again, depending on company size is important. Production stoppage. We're talking about manufacturing environments where you've got a factory with an assembly line and that assembly line has to stop. That can cost anywhere from $10,000 to $250,000 per hour when that assembly line stops. Then we've got regulatory fines, anywhere from $100 to $50,000 per record. And think about that one for a moment. Per record. So if you have a database that's compromised and it's got 1 million records in that database, even if you get the minimum fine of $100 per record, that's still $100 million. So those regulatory fines can be absolutely catastrophic. And then there are other factors to consider, such as damage to the organization's reputation. The reason why I give you all of these statistics is just to point out the serious importance of protecting your data. There are some really, really bad things, as you've seen here, that can happen if you suffer a major data loss event, whether that data loss is tied to something like an accidental deletion or if it's tied to something more serious like a security breach. Data loss is data loss. It all comes down to the same thing. So what does data loss cost? Well, there was a 2018 study by the Ponemon Institute, and at the time they said that the average cost of data loss, again average, was $3.6 million or $141 per record. Now, that particular study placed a heavy emphasis on data breaches. So a data loss event that is tied to something like an accidental deletion would probably have a lower price tag, and the price tag would also be lower in a smaller organization. But still, you can't ignore the fact that there are some significant costs associated with the data loss event. Now, what I found particularly interesting about this is that this year, the Ponemon Institute revisited that particular study, and they found that the average cost of a data loss event had increased from $3.6 million to $4.24 million. So that's a pretty significant increase. But even beyond that, they found that the costs were exponentially higher in regulated industries. For example, they cited the estimated cost at $9.23 million in a healthcare organization. And that all ties back to those regulatory fines that I mentioned earlier. So what about Microsoft 365? Where does Microsoft 365 come into play with all of this? Well, Microsoft uses something they call the shared responsibility model for the cloud. What this means is that Microsoft takes responsibility for some things, and they expect their subscribers to take responsibility for other things. More specifically, Microsoft is responsible for the health of the cloud infrastructure. They keep the Microsoft 365 applications running, they keep the underlying servers healthy, and they make sure that Microsoft 365 remains available. The responsibility of their customers is to use any available security mechanisms to keep their data secure, which there are any number of security mechanisms that are built into Microsoft 365 that you actually have to go in and turn on. And you're also responsible for backing up your own data. So if a data loss event does occur, you can't just pick up the phone and call Microsoft and ask them to restore a file for you. It doesn't work that way. Microsoft expects you to handle that part yourself. So since you are responsible for protecting your own data, and there are huge costs associated with data loss events, what types of things do you need to protect against? Well, it's actually a really long list. One of the things that you need to protect against that I've mentioned several times is accidental deletions. And this is something that happens very commonly. You know, she would probably kill me if she knew I was mentioning this, but my wife actually suffered an accidental deletion just last weekend. Thankfully, there was a backup, so data loss was minimal, but she's one of these people that knows better than to accidentally delete data. She's, you know, very smart, very experienced with computers, and she's not the type that would go in and accidentally delete something by doing something dumb, but it happened. You know, it just goes to show that anybody can accidentally delete data, so that is absolutely something that has to be considered and planned for. Also, accidental overwrites, overwriting good data with bad data or incorrect data. And the tricky thing about the accidental overwrites is it's typically not something that gets discovered right away. You might discover that the wrong data has been entered into a spreadsheet months after it happened. So that's something you've got to think about too, because truly that is a form of data loss. Ransomware attacks. I think we all know what ransomware is, and sadly the ransomware problem is getting worse, not better. Rogue employees. An employee who has some kind of beef with the organization and goes in and attempts to sabotage the organization by deleting data. That's something that none of us want to think about, but it is something that happens from time to time in the real world, and something that you should plan against and have contingencies in place for. Hackers, and then platform failures. Remember what I said about the shared responsibility model. Microsoft is responsible for maintaining their own infrastructure, but even so, we've seen major cloud outages in the past. Just a couple of days ago, we had a Google Cloud outage. We also recently saw a Facebook outage, and I could go on and on. So it's not unthinkable to think that the entire Microsoft 365 cloud could go down for a period of time. Now, Microsoft is responsible for that. They're going to bring it back online, but what would happen if when they did bring it back online, every bit of your data was gone? Hopefully nothing like that will ever happen, but it's a good idea to have some sort of plan in place in case it ever does. And then you should also protect against anything else that you can think of. So let's get into the best practices. Best practice number 1, limit the blast radius. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, when it comes to data loss, users can only delete what they have access to. The same thing goes for ransomware. Typically, when a ransomware attack occurs, and not in every situation, but typically, it's because an end user clicked on something that they shouldn't have. And when that ransomware initiates, it's only going to be able to attack things that that particular user has access to. So one way that you can reduce the damage is by limiting what it is that the user is able to access. So look for ways of reducing unnecessary file access. And I'm not going to get into this too much because it's something that the previous speaker spoke on at length, but I do want to underscore the importance of doing that. As I was compiling this presentation, I found a statistic that said that nearly 40% of companies have over 10,000 sensitive files that are open to everyone, and that means everyone in the organization, not the public at large. So think about that. If you've got all of these sensitive files that everybody in the organization has access to, imagine what could happen to those sensitive files if a user takes it upon themselves to delete those files, or if they suffer a ransomware attack or something like that. You could lose all of that sensitive data. So look for ways of reducing unnecessary file access. Now, you've got to balance security with functionality, because I've seen way too many examples of organizations that take security to the extreme, and in doing so, they make it very, very difficult for the end users to do their job. Security should protect you, but without getting in the way of the end users, so it's important to always keep that balance in mind. Best practice number 2, war game data protection. What I mean by this is think about things that could happen and ways that you can counter against that particular event if it did happen. As I was researching this presentation, I found a statistic that said that 75% of small businesses don't have a disaster recovery plan. And at first that statistic floored me. I'm thinking, oh, that can't possibly be right. And I think that the reason why I thought that is because before I walked away from my corporate job, I worked for some really large enterprise environments. And of course they had disaster recovery plans. But then I really started thinking about it. And over the years, I've had countless friends that have worked for small businesses or owned small businesses that have suffered various data loss events and asked me to come in and help them see if they could recover some data. And none of them, at least not that I can remember, had a disaster recovery plan in place. It was just, uh-oh, this happened, what do I do now? So I wouldn't stop at saying you need a disaster recovery plan. I would say you need multiple disaster recovery plans, because no two disasters are alike. And I've worked in IT for roughly about 30 years, and I've never seen two disasters that have gone down in exactly the same way or that have required exactly the same type of recovery. There's always something different. So my advice would be to prepare multiple disaster recovery plans that are laser focused on very specific situations that could conceivably happen. So another best practice, use security automation. As I was putting this together, I found a quote from a company called Comparitech that said, incident response and security automation shows the greatest potential for cost savings. And then they went on to explain that the cost of a breach was cut almost in half through the use of security automation. it went from 3.58 million to 2 million. And they went on to say that a breach that lasts less than 200 days, in other words, if the entire mess is cleaned up in less than 200 days and everything's put back to normal, then that particular breach is going to have a price tag that's total cost is 30% lower than a breach that goes on longer than 200 days. So the bottom line is that the faster you can deal with a security breach, and I would venture to say any data loss event, even if it's not tied to a security breach, is going to cost less and be less damaging to the organization. So look for ways that you can automate your security. Put tools in place that will automatically detect a security breach that might initially go unnoticed to humans, and lock it down so that way you can get ahead of a breach while it's in progress rather than discovering it later and having to go through great lengths to clean up the mess once all is said and done. So another best practice, and this is one that's super easy to overlook, but something that I would recommend to anybody, is make sure that the funds are available for dealing with disaster recovery. There was a study that I found while I was putting all of this together that said that more than half of businesses don't have enough budget to recover from data incidents. And, that's another one of those that's really hard to hear, but I think it's true. Data breaches are expensive. And other types of data loss events can also be expensive, even if you're able to get the data back. Because anytime that you're restoring from cloud backup, there are cloud egress fees to consider, and those cloud egress fees can be quite substantial depending on how much data that you're restoring. And there can be other costs that come into play as well, everything from lost productivity to data loss that occurs, even if you got a backup, because there's always going to be at least some gap between the time that data was created to the time that it's backed up, and any data that was created during that gap is going to be lost because it hasn't been backed up yet. So there are all of these costs that come into play. So it's extremely important to make sure that you've got the budget for dealing with that, whether we're talking about a restoration or cleaning up after a data breach. Now, a lot of organizations have emergency funds that are set aside, but typically these are unknown to the IT department. So it might be a good idea to have a talk with whoever's in charge at your organization and just point out some of the costs that can be associated with a data loss event or a data breach, and make sure that emergency funds are going to be available to you should the need ever occur. We all like to hope that we're never going to have to deal with this type of a situation, but it's important to have a plan for if the situation ever does happen to occur. Another best practice, adopt the modern 3-2-1 rule. And this is something that I came up with. I recently wrote about it in my Posey's Tips and Tricks blog. I don't know if it's been published yet or not, but I'll go over this one a little bit. So the 3-2-1 rule is one of those things that's been around absolutely forever. And it's long been regarded as a best practice for backups. But I think that it's safe to say that the 3-2-1 rule, at least as it's written, has kind of outlived its usefulness. If you're not familiar with this rule, the 3 part of it states that you need to have 3 copies of your data. That's the original data and 2 backup copies. So there's the 3 copies. The 2 indicates that backups need to be written to 2 different types of media. At the time that the rule was created, that was tape and disk, but there were variations on it. I saw organizations that used tape and optical storage or something else. And then the 1 indicates that 1 copy should be stored off-site. Now, this particular model worked really, really well pre-cloud, but it doesn't really translate all that well to the era of the cloud. So even though the 3-2-1 backup rule is old and outdated, I think that there's still value in it, at least if you look at the spirit of the rule, because the 3-2-1 rule does 3 things. First of all, it ensures that you've got redundant backups. Remember, the very first part of the 3-2-1 rule is have 3 copies of your data, the original data and 2 backups. So there's backup redundancy there. In other words, if one backup fails, you've got another backup to fall back on. It also protects against a site-level failure by isolating backups from one another. One of those backup copies is going to be stored off of site. And it also ensures that you're using 2 different types of media, because remember that statistic that I pointed out back at the very beginning of the presentation that I showed you to keep in mind, that 77% of the tape backups that were tested ended up failing? Well, think about that. That if you had 2 tape backups of the same data, if one failed, chances are the other is probably going to fail too, because it was written with the same backup software and the same tape drive. So you may end up in a situation in which you've got multiple redundant backups, but none of them are any good. The 3-2-1 rule is designed to protect against that by telling you to use 2 different types of media. And then the third thing that the old 3-2-1 rule does is it ensures that one backup copy is always easily accessible. You know, one backup copy gets stored off-site, but another one is right there and ready for you to use. And that part's super important. I can't help but think about one of the places that I used to work back in the 90s. Back then, all we had was tape backup, and at the time, tape backup drives were really slow, tapes were expensive, and it just wasn't practical to create multiple tape backups of a large data set every single night, which is the way that things were done back then. So the guy who was in charge said that we've got this one backup, we need to keep that backup safe, and the best way to do that is to ship it off-site, which was very sound reasoning. The problem with that is that we had a courier that would come by first thing in the morning every single day and pick up the previous night's backup tape. And that always happened roughly about 7 a.m. Well, one day we ended up having a crash at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and had to restore a backup. Well, we no longer are in possession of the backup tape. We had shipped it off-site several hours before. So we had to contact the company, pay extra for an unscheduled tape delivery, and then wait a couple of hours for them to bring us the tape, and only then could we start the recovery process. That's the sort of thing that the old 3-2-1 rule is designed to guard against. It makes sure that one backup copy is stored off-site, but another one is easy to reach, easy to use. But as I said, the old 3-2-1 rule has really outlived its usefulness. There are good parts of the rule, but the rule itself doesn't work very well in the cloud era. So how can we improve upon this? Well, here's my version of a modern 3-2-1 backup rule. First of all, the 3 indicated you need 3 data copies, your original data, and 2 backups. Today, it's a lot easier to create multiple backups. So I would say have your original data plus at least 3 backups, as opposed to at least 2 backups. There's no reason to limit yourself to 2 backups if you feel like you need additional backup redundancy. For the 2 portion of the rule, I would say back that data up to at least 2 different clouds. And while you're at it, make sure that you're storing data in at least 2 different regions. So that way, if there's a massive disaster that takes out an entire region, you've got another copy of your data in a different cloud in a different part of the world, so you're all good. You've got data that you can recover if necessary. And then the 1 portion, rather than having 1 copy of the tape shipped off-site or whatever, make sure that you've got a backup copy that's in close proximity to the original data. I've heard a lot of people say that if you're backing up cloud data, there's no reason to store that backup on premises. Store it in the cloud. You brought that data in the cloud in the first place for a reason. In the case of restoring a Microsoft 365 backup, that probably makes a lot of sense. You really don't want to be restoring an on-premises backup copy up to Microsoft 365 if you can avoid it, because that's going to be a slow process. So instead, focus on having at least 1 copy of your backup that's up in the cloud and in close proximity to your Microsoft 365 data. For example, maybe you want to store that data in, or that backup in Azure, because the Azure data center is presumably in close proximity to the Microsoft 365 data center. So what about some other best practices? One best practice is to make sure that your disaster recovery and incident response plans are completely comprehensive. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but that doesn't make it any less important. So I recommend designating a disaster recovery team and an incident response team, and then having them work on and continually revise your disaster recovery and response plans. So what should be included in those plans? Well, this is one of those subjects that I could probably do an entire presentation on. There's no way that we have time to deal with this in any sort of comprehensive way in the context of this presentation. But I do want to at least give you a few things to think about including in those plans. For starters, stakeholder contact information. At the very least, you want to have the contact information for the IT professionals who are going to be responsible for getting your data back or dealing with the security incident or whatever the case may be. But you're also going to want to have contact information on hand for upper management in case they need to know what's going on. If it's a security incident and it's something that could leak out to the public, you want to have contact information for your public relations people or anybody who plays a role in compliance. it's very important that you have a way of being able to get in touch with whoever it is you need to get in touch with at the time of a disaster. Also, outline roles and responsibilities. In some ways, this seems perfectly obvious, but it's good to go ahead and formalize those roles and responsibilities just so everybody knows what it is that they're supposed to be doing in the event that you ever have to put one of these plans into action. Also, include specific recovery instructions. I've run into situations in the real world where an organization suffered a data loss event. They had a backup, but the backup wasn't really something that they used all the time. So even though they backed up on a regular basis, it took them a little while to figure out how restore worked. They just kind of had to find their way through the user interface and figure out where the data set was that they wanted to restore. I know it sounds silly, but it has absolutely happened, and I've seen it more than once. So when you're having a disaster, that's not the time to be figuring out how to use your backup software. It's a good idea to just go ahead and take the time to write out step by step how to get data back should the need arise. Because that way, if you're in the moment and your head's not clear, you've got a million things that you're focused on, figuring out how your backup software shouldn't be one of them. So what else? Software license information, technical support contacts. So if you happen to have a support contract for your backup software or for your servers or what have you, make sure that you've got contact information and any applicable license information or support contract information easily accessible to whoever is going to be executing these plans that you've come up with. And also, make sure that your SLAs are written out. SLAs are surface level agreements. They stipulate how long you've got to recover from the disaster, as well as typically some other things. So let's talk a little bit more about SLAs. SLAs are one of those things that, for the longest time, I always thought of them as a bad thing, at least from an IT perspective, because they formalize the level of service that the organization expects from the IT department. They might say that during a data loss event, you're only allowed to lose X amount of data and you have to have the whole thing recovered within so many minutes. So SLAs put a lot of pressure on IT. But as time kind of went on, I started realizing that SLAs can also work to the IT department's advantage if you use them properly. Let me give you an example. Back when I was with the military, we had a major data loss event. And as we were dealing with that, we had one of the upper brass come into the data center seemingly every few minutes. It probably wasn't quite that frequently, and yell and scream and carry on, and that wasn't doing anybody any good. The 10 minutes he would spend yelling at the top of his lungs was 10 minutes we could have used to get a little bit more data back or to dig into the root of the problem. So if you've got an SLA that stipulates that you've got so many minutes to deal with a problem, then use that to your advantage. Have somebody who is designated with the task of just keeping all of the outsiders out of the data center or wherever you happen to be working on the recovery operation from, and fielding any questions that they might have so that you don't have to deal with that during that time period. Oh, and one other thing that I'll say about the SLA before I move on is typically the SLAs will demonstrate how much data you are allowed to use. Because remember what I said, there's always a gap between the last time that a backup was made and the time that an event happens, and you're going to lose any data that's accumulated during that gap because it hasn't been backed up yet. Typically, that's something that's formalized in the SLA. So if after a data loss event happens, you manage to get everything back that was in the backups, and it falls within that amount of data loss that is allowed by the SLA, then having that written down can be something that you can give to your boss and say, look, we did everything that we were supposed to do. We lived up to our commitment. So that way, nothing bad comes back on you. Another best practice, revisit your recovery plans on a regular basis. It's amazing how quickly recovery plans can become stale. So keep contact information up to date. Update your procedures as technology changes. If, for example, you get a new version of your backup software, then make sure that you update any written instructions to reflect that new version. Revise the roles that are outlined in your disaster recovery plans as staff changes. People are promoted, people leave the organization, whatever. Also, consider anything that you might be able to do to improve upon the plan. You should always be asking yourself the question, what can I do to make this better? Another best practice, test the plan. one of the stats that I ran into as I was putting together this presentation was that only 55% of companies performed recovery testing in 2019. So this goes back to what I was talking about wargaming. Try to come up with creative data loss situations and see if you can recover from that. Remember, Microsoft will allow you to set up trial Microsoft 365 accounts. It's really easy to do. All you need is an email address. All you need is an email address. You don't even have to have a credit card. So you can set up Microsoft 365 trials, create some mock data, and then cause data loss events, and just test your ability to recover from those events. It's a great way of testing your plan. Another best practice, and this is something that I touched on in my presentation about a month ago, is back up everything, whether you need it or not. There are a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is that sometimes you may not necessarily realize data's value until later on. I've seen situations in the real world in which seemingly unimportant data became important months later. There was a business data that somebody realized they could glean from that data that hadn't previously been discovered. So it's a good idea to make sure that data is protected, even if it doesn't seem important. The bigger reason is that just because you're not using a particular Microsoft 365 application doesn't mean that the other Microsoft 365 applications aren't using that. Teams is a great example of that. If you think about the way that other applications work, they store the data within the application. SharePoint, for example, stores data within SQL Server backup, or SQL Server databases, rather. Exchange stores data in the Exchange information store. Teams doesn't work like that. It doesn't have a dedicated data repository. Instead, it stores data in various places within SharePoint, Exchange, and within Azure. So it's important to back up the entire Microsoft 365 cloud, even if you're not using particular applications, because chances are other applications like Teams are using them. Another best practice is to treat the native recovery mechanisms as convenience features rather than treating them as true data recovery mechanisms. There are various mechanisms that are built into the Microsoft 365 cloud that you can use to get back data that was deleted accidentally. But I wouldn't bet your job on relying on those in the event that a major data loss event happens. You're going to want to have a real backup and recovery solution in place rather than relying solely on these mechanisms. And there are lots of reasons for that. A lot of times these mechanisms won't provide the necessary level of protection. They may leave gaps in coverage. There are all sorts of things to consider. Teams is a great example of that because consider what happens when you delete a team and you need to get that back. Every team that you create has a corresponding Azure AD group. So if you delete a team, what Microsoft 365 does behind the scenes is it deletes that group. Now, there is a way using the native recovery mechanisms to get that back. You have to open up PowerShell, and there are a couple of commandlets that you enter, and you undelete that group. It's stored in the Azure AD recycle bin. And when you bring that group back, then you effectively recreate the team. But having said that, this recovery process is all or nothing. In other words, you can recover an entire team using that method, but you can't recover individual elements from within that team. For example, a chat or a file that's been shared within Teams or something like that. So the recovery process is all or nothing. That's why it's so important to use a good backup solution, because a good backup solution will give you that granularity that you need to go in and recover individual items as opposed to recovering the entire team or nothing at all. So what mechanisms exist for deleted item recovery within Microsoft 365? Well, here's a few of them. There's the OneDrive recycle bin. It stores items for 93 days, assuming that you're using a Microsoft 365 account. If you're using a Microsoft account, then that retention period is reduced to 30 days. SharePoint also has a recycle bin, and again, deleted items are retained for 93 days. And Microsoft actually has the ability to recover items for you for another 14 days after that retention period expires. But if you have to call upon Microsoft to do this, they'll have to recover the entire site collection. They can't recover individual files. And that's probably done for security reasons so that you don't have Microsoft support people with access to your data. There's also the Azure AD recycle bin, which I mentioned a moment ago. And The Azure AD Recycle Bin is able to restore Azure Active Directory objects for up to 30 days after they were deleted. So why not just use these built-in protective mechanisms? And I didn't cover quite all of them. Well, for one thing, recovery can sometimes be complex. I mentioned it in the case of Teams, for example, that recovering a team involves using PowerShell. Also, your recovery options might not be quite as granular as you would like for them to be. Again, I go back to Teams. You can recover an entire team using the native mechanisms, but you can't recover individual items within that team, like files or chats or what have you. Also, the individual items can leave gaps in protection, and there are some security threats that you might not be protected against. Let's say for a moment that you were hit by ransomware. Well, ransomware is going to encrypt your data, not delete it. So because the data wasn't deleted, it's not going to exist within the recycle bin for you to just go back and undelete. Similarly, if you have a rogue user who decides to sabotage your organization, they might go in and delete a bunch of files, but once they do, they might choose to go in and empty out the recycle bin, eliminating your ability to get those files back. So these are just a few of the reasons why I recommend using a dedicated third-party backup solution as opposed to just relying on the built-in native protective mechanisms. Another best practice is work towards zero trust security. Zero trust security has been a huge trend over the last few years, and it's based on the idea that nothing should just be assumed to be trustworthy. Everything has to be proven. So zero trust security works really, really well because it can help to protect you from everything from accidental deletion to rogue employees to malware if it's implemented correctly. Now, one thing that you have to consider is that zero trust security isn't going to completely stop an attack, especially if that attack comes from a rogue user who has permission to access the various data elements. But using zero trust security can help to limit the blast radius. And this all goes back to what I was talking about at the very beginning, about if a user doesn't specifically need access to something, they shouldn't be able to access that, so that way you can reduce the damage that can occur if that user goes rogue or if that user accidentally clicks on something that they shouldn't and unleashes a malware attack. Another best practice, adopt conditional access policies. So what are conditional access policies? Well, there's something that's built into Azure AD, and they're meant to take the place of the old school access control list that we typically have used in the past. Historically, with Windows Server, the way that access has been granted to resources, and I'm talking primarily about on-premises right now, is that you have a folder, and that folder has an access control list. You create a group. That group contains the users who need to access the files, and then you assign that group to the access control list. And then by doing that, everybody in the group has access to everything in that folder. That's the way it's always worked. What conditional access policies do is they build on that concept so that access isn't quite so black and white. There are other things that are considered when considering whether or not to grant user access to a particular resource. So I like to think of conditional access policies as being kind of like an if-then statement. If this condition is true, then we'll allow access, or we won't allow access. The if portion is known in Microsoft speak as a signal, and the then portion of the statement is known as a decision. So we're looking at a signal, and then we're making a decision based on that signal. And incidentally, you are going to need Azure AD Premium P1 in order to use these conditional access policies. Now, I don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to quickly give you a rundown of some examples of signals and decisions. Signals consist of a user account, a group membership. So if, remember, a signal is an if-then statement. So if a user is a member of a particular group, then we grant them access to a resource. But you can go beyond that. You can look at things like the type of device that the user is working from. Is it a trusted device? What operating system is it running? Is the operating system jailbroken? What IP address are they coming in from? Is that IP address in a trusted location? Is it in a foreign country that you don't trust? Where is the user located? What type of application is being accessed? And you can go on and on with this. There are any number of different signals that you can look at when making a decision. You can even look at, is the user doing something out of the ordinary or risky? But if you're going to look at that, you're going to need Azure AD Premium P2. So what kind of decisions? Well, most decisions are grant access or deny access, but there is a bit of gray area in between. you can choose to grant access but with restrictions. So if, for example, a user is accessing a resource that they have access to, it's something they access all the time, no big deal, but they're doing it from an untrusted location, well, then maybe you want to require multi-factor authentication before you allow them to access that resource, just so you can make sure that the user really is who they claim to be. You can also grant access, but only so long as the device that the user is using is compliant with your policies that you've set up through Intune. You can require the user to be using an approved client, or you can require that the device is Azure AD joined. So just a few words of caution if you are going to be using these conditional access policies is, first of all, beware of blanket policies because they can very often have unintended consequences. Another best practice is that when you create a new conditional access policy, make sure that you use report mode first, because report mode will tell you what would happen if the policy had been applied as opposed to actually applying the policy. So that way you can check for unintended consequences before you just unleash a brand new policy on your organization and hope for the best. Also, don't forget about service accounts, because when you create a blanket policy, very often service accounts can inadvertently be lumped into that. And that might sound like a good thing, but remember, the service accounts operate in a very different way from a typical user account. So if, for example, you were to require multi-factor authentication, well, it might be impossible for a service account to deliver that multi-factor authentication, so you can cause big problems by doing something like that. And then finally, always, always, always have a break glass account. A break glass account is an account that has access to absolutely everything and is used for the sole purpose of recovering if you happen to lock yourself out. So what you would want to do is create this account that has access to everything, give it a really, really, really strong password, write it down, lock it away in the safe, never to be used again except in the event of an absolute emergency. And this break glass account should be excluded from any conditional access policy that you create, so that way you've always got this one account that can come in and be used to fix the problem should the need arise. So I've covered a huge amount of material. I think I have a couple of minutes left to take some questions. David?
Yeah, well, great job, Brian.
Thank you.
And we'll get to those questions. We have plenty of time to answer them. But I actually have a question myself. I'm fascinated by the rogue employee threat you mentioned. And in an earlier presentation, you shared how you were fired for being a potential sabotage threat. I was wondering if you could share that again and then explain, how does an IT manager protect against potential rogue employee sabotage after they give 2 weeks' notice?
Yeah, great question. In that particular example, it was back in the 90s. I was working for a large insurance company, and I found a better job. And I'll just preface this by saying I didn't have any ill intent toward the company. They always treated me well, so it's no problem there. But I put in my 2 weeks' notice because I had found another job that was better and paid better. And my employer fired me on the spot because they considered me to be a security threat because I had access to everything. And so I walked away graciously, used the 2 weeks to go to the Bahamas, and I made sure to send my former boss a postcard thanking him for the time off. So a little bit of payback, but nothing malicious. But I do think that his concern was justified. Not that I would ever do something like that, but that wasn't directed personally at me. That was a policy for the organization as a whole. Anybody in IT puts in their 2 weeks' notice, they're removed immediately. But in today's world, I don't think that goes quite far enough, because there are other things that you would want to do. Obviously, you would want to deactivate that user's account immediately, but you would also want to make sure that you also immediately change any passwords that that employee happened to know. So if you've got an admin account that is used for this, that, or the other, you would want to make sure to change the password on that account, or maybe even rename that account if you can do that without breaking anything.
Okay, those make sense. Let's move along to the Q&A box. Here's a question. What do you consider to be the biggest potential source of data loss? Ransomware, accidental deletion, something else?
Well, I think that you really have to break that down into malicious versus non-malicious data loss. If we're talking about malicious data loss, then yeah, ransomware would easily be number one, probably far and away above everything else. If we're talking about non-malicious, then yeah, accidental file deletion, simply because I've seen that happen a lot more often than other types of non-malicious data loss, like just letting hardware go bad or accidentally overwriting information in the spreadsheet or something like that.
Okay. And you mentioned that restoring a backup can be expensive. And I think you mentioned egress fees. Can you clarify those costs, and are there others people have to watch out for?
Yeah, the egress fees are the main one. Typically, anytime that you store data in any of the big public clouds, there's a data egress fee that's associated with getting that data back out of the cloud. Now, these cloud providers don't so much care if you're removing the data from the cloud. Just copying the data to another location is enough to incur these egress fees. And it's something that the cloud providers put into place as a way of discouraging people from taking their data back out of the cloud and moving it somewhere else once it's in the cloud. So that only comes into play if you're restoring a cloud backup, but it is something that you need to be thinking about, because remember that data egress fee is meant to be punitive. So if you're restoring a cloud backup and the restore operation incurs that data egress fee, then you're going to incur a fairly substantial charge if you're restoring a lot of data. That's the main cost that I had in mind when I created that previous slide, but there can be other costs. If you've got lost productivity, if users aren't able to do their jobs until you get that data restored, that may not be a cost that you're going to get a bill for, but it's a cost nonetheless because you are losing productivity. So just things like that.
Okay. Here's a follow-on question from Anthony in the audience. He says, how do you estimate the egress fees / data restoration costs?
Every cloud provider out there posts their pricing online, and typically they have a cost calculator. So what you can do is go out to the cloud where your backup is stored and just look at their data egress fee calculator, and it will usually give you a price of so many cents per gigabyte or something like that. And you just multiply that based on the amount of data that you could potentially have to restore in a worst-case scenario, and that will give you the cost. Now, one thing that I do want to quickly mention is that there are a couple of smaller cloud providers out there that make S3-compatible storage that don't charge data egress fees. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head who they are because I would probably get it wrong, but they are out there.
Okay. Next question is a little more specific. Do you recommend moving all of your on-premises file server content to OneDrive or SharePoint?
No, I don't. OneDrive and SharePoint were never really designed to fully take the place of an on-premises file server. If you're looking to move the contents of your file server to the cloud, I think you would be better off setting up a server in Azure as opposed to using SharePoint for all of that. There are some data types that really don't work all that well in OneDrive and SharePoint. For example, if you've got a really large file that people access all the time, then every time somebody accesses that file, that great big file is going to have to get downloaded. That's going to require wait time for the user, and it just doesn't translate into a great end-user experience. There are also certain types of data that SharePoint is a little bit more accepting of than others. So those are some of the things that you have to think about. But Azure Files is a good alternative if you're looking to move everything to the cloud.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And it reads, if an email contains malware, what is the best way to remove it from Exchange Online?
The best thing that you can do is to set up filtering so that emails are screened for malware before they ever make it into a user's inbox. And typically what that will do is either remove the attachment or it will just quarantine the entire email message so that that never makes it into the user's inbox and that doesn't become a threat. As an alternative, you can also set up rules in your on-premises environment so that it looks at messages that do arrive in users' inboxes and gets rid of files with questionable file types.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Brian, for an excellent presentation and answering those questions.
Absolutely.
Okay, everyone else, I'm going to pass it on to McKenna for some closing announcements and the giveaway of our Nintendo Switch. McKenna?
Hi, thanks, David. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I do have a few closing announcements before we depart. As you leave, you'll be asked to take a short survey with your opinions of this event. Please be sure to share your honest opinions. Our editors read through every single comment during every single summit, and they really use them to help shape our future events and give you what you want to see. And speaking of future events, we really want to thank Rubric for sponsoring this event because they believe in this community and want to support events like these. So please show your support and appreciation by visiting their site and contacting them for their services. They have provided a link to a Microsoft 365 demo specifically for the summit in your audience console, so please check that out when you can. It's through their underwriting of these events that we can bring more summits in the future. So thank you to Rubric, and thank you to our speakers and our fellow moderators. And now let's draw the winner of our Nintendo Switch. Congratulations to Akani Salako. I'm hoping the pronunciation is close enough. Akani, you have won our Nintendo Switch. Our team will be in contact with you on how to claim your prize, probably at some point this week, so keep an eye out for that. And that is it for our summit today, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining. You will get a replay email in the next few days, and we hope you enjoyed this event. Please do take the survey that pops up when you exit. Thank you, and thank you again to Rubric. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you next time.